On the morning of January 22, 1943, at 9:17, Second Lieutenant John George was hiding in the broken remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. He was looking at a banyan tree that was 240 yards away through a scope which his fellow officers had made fun of for 6 weeks. 27 years old, Illinois state champion, 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had 11 snipers hiding in the Point Cruz Groves, and over the last 3 days, they have killed 14 soldiers from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's boss said his rifle was just a toy. The other platoon leaders called it his mail-order sweetheart. When he took out the Winchester Model 70 with its Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin mount at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the armorer asked if it was meant for hunting deer or for shooting Germans. George explained it was for the Japanese. They shipped out before the rifle arrived. George spent the time traveling to Guadalcanal by watching other men clean their garons while his own weapon was still stored in a warehouse in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant gave him a wooden crate that was labeled Fragile. Inside was the rifle he had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. The rifle weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12. The large gun given to each other soldier in his group weighed 9 to 12 pounds, without using any magnifying tools. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds. The Garand was semi-automatic, 8 rounds. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry took over from the Marines on Guadalcanal in December 1942. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had taken Henderson Field. They had kept control of it, but they hadn't taken Mount Austin, and they hadn't removed the Japanese from the coastal areas west of the Matanakaw River. Mount Austin stood 1,514 feet tall. The Japanese called it the GEU. 500 men, 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 days. They lost 34 soldiers who were killed and 279 who were injured before they successfully captured the western slope on January 2nd. By that time, George had never actually shot his Winchester rifle in a real fight. The jungle around Point Cruz was different. No trenches, no set spots, just Japanese soldiers who had run west from Henderson Field and hidden themselves in the big trees. Some of those soldiers were snipers. They had scoped Arisaka Type 98s. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling cans at a creek. On January 20th, a sniper killed 2 men from L Company while they were on patrol. On January 21st, 3 more men died. One of them was shot through the neck by a tree that the patrol had walked past twice. The battalion commander summoned George that night. The Japanese snipers were killing his men quicker than malaria could spread. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George explained his credentials. Illinois State Championship at 100 yards in 1939. At 23 years old, he was the youngest winner in the state's history. He competed in groups of 6 at 600 yards using iron sights. He also shot 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards with the Lyman Alaskan. The commander told him he had until morning to show it. If you're curious about how George's civilian rifle worked against Japanese snipers who were trained for fighting in the jungle, click the like button. It allows us to share more stories that have been forgotten. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to George. George spent the night checking his rifle. The Winchester had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned it again. He checked the scope mounts. He put in 5 rounds of .306 hunting bullets that he had brought from Tennessee. Military ball ammo. The same cartridge the Garand fired. On January 22nd, at dawn, George took his place in the ruins of a Japanese bunker that his battalion had taken control of 3 days before. The bunker had a view of the coconut trees that were to the west of Point Cruz. Intelligence stated that the Japanese snipers were positioned in the big trees in that area, specifically the banyan trees. Some of them reached 90 feet tall with trunks 8 feet thick. A sniper might climb one of those trees before daybreak and stay there all day without anyone noticing. George didn't have a spotter or a radio operator with him. He only carried his rifle, a water container, and 60 bullets in clips. He got comfortable in the bunker and started looking at the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5 power magnification. Not much, but enough to notice movement in the branches that you can't see with just your eyes. The jungle was never silent. Birds, insects, the distant sound of artillery. George had learned to ignore the distractions and pay attention to what was moving. He glized the tree slowly, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17, he saw it. A branch moved. No wind, just a small shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man in dark clothes stood at a place where 3 branches split off. The Japanese sniper was looking toward the east, keeping an eye on the path where George's group had been carrying supplies. George turned the scope adjustment 2 clicks to the right to compensate for the wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, 32 pounds. He spent a lot of time setting it up at Camp Perry before the war started. Now he would find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell. He dropped through the branches. His body fell 90 feet and landed close to the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt. The empty cartridge ejected. He chambered another round. He kept his telescope focused on the tree, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing. The Japanese sniper's partner would be close. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had killed the shooter, the spotter was hiding in that tree or in the trees around it. George scanned the surrounding banyans. The scope's 2.5 power magnification forced him to search slowly. Each tree could hide multiple men. The thick roof of the jungle made dark shadows that turned things into shapes you couldn't tell apart unless you looked closely. At 9:43, he found the second sniper. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe about 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He heard the gunshot and realized his position was no longer safe. George aimed, led the movement, fired. The second sniper went backward off the tree. His rifle made a clattering sound as it passed through the branches in front of him. Both hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This was just like shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets were able to shoot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet hit the sandbag that was 6 feet away from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving. He moved slowly back to his shooting spot and looked through his scope at the trees in the southwest direction. The shooter would have moved after firing the shot. That was basic sniper doctrine: shoot and relocate. In a jungle this dense, relocation options were limited. George saw him at 11:38, standing at the 3rd tree from the left in a group of 5 banyan trees, 73 feet up. The Japanese soldier moved to another part of the tree, but stayed in the same tree. A mistake. George aimed the crosshairs at the dark shape and pulled the trigger. The 3rd sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had made fun of his mail-order rifle now wanted to watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese snipers adjusted their tactics following the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon looking through trees with a glass and didn't see anything. At 4 p.m., he went back to the battalion's main base. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd started with heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and made the trees hard to see beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain stopped at 8:15. By 8:45, visibility was good enough to start work. George identified the first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The sound of rain masked movement. This sniper picked a tree that was 290 yards away, which is a longer distance than the day before. Also smart. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell. The sixth kill got a reaction that George wasn't expecting. At 0957, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. They determined his location based on the muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third salvo would hit the bunker. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He ran quickly north along the tree line and jumped into a shell crater. As the third volley hit, the bunker he had been in just a moment ago was destroyed by explosions and flying pieces. He relocated to a different position. A tree that fell down is 120 yards north of the bunker that was destroyed. The tree offered shade and a good view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. They were now hunting him back. The dynamic had changed. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. At 14:23, George killed his seventh sniper. At 15:41, he killed his eighth. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up a banyan tree. Good hiding, but the height made a shadow against the sky when the sun's position changed. At 5 p.m., Captain Morris sent a runner to get George back. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George told that he had 8 confirmed kills in 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 8 kills, 4 misses. Morris told George to keep doing the sniper missions beginning at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and thought about the math. 11 Japanese snipers were active in the Point Cruz Groves. 8 now dead, 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived the longest. Now they knew exactly what George looked like and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 a.m., he gave up and sat in his tent with the rifle resting across his lap. The rain started again at 04:15. By 05:30, the situation was severe enough to cause delays in the dawn operations. George used the time to move to a new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree. Somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He picked a place 70 yards to the south of where he was before, which was a group of big rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun position back in December. The position provided good cover and allowed overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He got comfortable and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43, the rain slowed down to a light drizzle. Visibility improved. George began glassing trees. At 08:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out. Low, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sightlines. This one had chosen concealment over elevation. The palm fronts created a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. But George was not at ground level. He was elevated on the rocks. The angle let him see down into the fronds. He could see the dark outline of the sniper's shoulders and head. George aimed, took a deep breath, and started squeezing the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been searching for snipers for 3 days. He had killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make elementary mistakes.
They wouldn't stand in a place where someone up high could see them unless they were trying to lure someone in. George put down his rifle and looked around at the trees nearby. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash and ready to return fire. George carefully broke the trees down, starting from the left and moving to the right, going up and then down. He looked at every tree that was within 300 yards of the palm. It took 11 minutes. At 08:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree located 80 yards to the northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was set up in a great hiding spot. Branches and vines hid him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to show up there or to try to catch the bait hanging in the palm tree. George had 2 problems. The actual sniper was looking at the wrong place. If George fired at him, the sound would reveal George's actual position. The sniper would move to a new position before George had a chance to pull the bolt and load another bullet. If he didn't do anything, the sniper would eventually figure out George wasn't at the fallen tree and start looking for him. George chose to use the bait on them. He aimed at the fake sniper in the palm tree, accounted for the wind, and shot. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from the palm. George quickly turned his rifle toward the banyan tree, which was 91 feet up. The real sniper would respond to the shot. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. He saw it. A slight shift. The sniper was adjusting position to target George's location. George aimed the crosshairs at the dark shape and fired before the sniper had time to turn completely. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had told his position to anyone who was watching. He picked up his rifle and bullets and started running. He walked east towards the rocky area and then went into a drainage ditch that was 40 yards away. He buried himself in the mud and stayed still. At 8:34, Japanese machine guns shot at the rocks where he had been standing just 6 seconds before. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George waited for 60 seconds before moving on. He moved again, this time to a spot 100 yards to the east, which was a shell crater that had some rainwater in it. George settled into the crater with water up to his chest. He placed the Winchester on the edge of the crater and continued looking through the scope at the trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He had seen 10 of his friends die within 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew George's rifle. He knew George's approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, and making plans. George scanned the jungle through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan magnification allowed distant shapes to be seen, but not recognized clearly. Every dark spot might be a tree branch or a person. George had to study each one carefully. At 09:47, he realized his mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was lying on the ground and moving towards George's spot. He noticed movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards to the south, low to the ground. A shape moving through the bushes next to the trees. The Japanese sniper was utilizing the jungle floor vegetation for cover. Ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was moving slowly toward where George had been last seen at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered. His breathing stayed steady, but the angle wasn't right. The edge of the crater prevented him from seeing the sniper coming. He would need to stand up to get a clear view. Rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 09:52. He had gotten to a spot that was 40 yards away from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was examining the rocks, looking for any movement that might indicate the presence of his target. George waited. Patience was the most important skill in sniper work. The skill of staying calm, letting time go by, waiting for the perfect moment instead of taking a poor shot. At 09:58, the Japanese sniper started moving again. He moved forward 35 yards from the rocks. 30 yards. 25 yards. He was coming from the south side, the same side George had used when he left under fire from machine guns. He understood the tactic. The Japanese sniper had been watching the machine gun attack. He knew that George had moved east away from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He went into the machine gun nest and took a position facing east toward the drainage ditch, where George was supposed to move to. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. He had a clear shot. Center mass, 38 yard. An easy shot, even without a scope. But George hesitated. This Japanese sniper had lived through 10 days of American military actions in the Point Cruz Groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers, men who died because they made errors. This man would not make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No skilled sniper would stay in that spot for more than a couple of seconds. This had to be another fake one, another setup. George stayed focused on the sniper in the rocks, but also paid attention to what was happening around him. If this was bait, the real threat would be positioned to cover it, somewhere with line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, he found it. A second Japanese soldier was 70 yards to the northwest of the rocks, hiding behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier wasn't moving or changing position. He was just standing there, looking and waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding.
His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not one. The 11th sniper had brought support. Maybe those 2 were the last snipers, number 10 and 11, teaming up together. George made his decision. He wasn't able to shoot both men before they responded. The bolt-action Winchester needed him to operate the action between each shot. That gave them time to find him and shoot back. He needed a different approach. George began to sink lower into the water. Slowly. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester upright to keep the barrel clean. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. They were heading toward the 2 dead snipers. George heard branches breaking, equipment rattling. These were not snipers. Infantry. A group of team members goes to get the bodies. George counted seconds. The voices stopped at the location of the first body, 42 yards from his crater. Close enough that he could hear them clearly, even if he didn't know what they were saying. Then the voices went to the second body. More conversation, urgent tones. At 10:28, the voices began moving again, not back toward the tree line, toward George's crater. They had found his tracks. Footprints in the mud going from the rocks toward the crater. George made sure to be quiet and not move around a lot. He had not been careful about tracks. George had 5 rounds in the Winchester, 6 Japanese soldiers at minimum. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. He considered his options. Stay out of sight and hope they don't notice you, or be ready to fight. The voices grew closer. 30 yards, 25 yards, 20 yards. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier showed up at the edge of the crater. He was looking down directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, and rose up. 2 additional soldiers were standing at the edge of the crater. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers dropped. 3 rounds left. George could hear shouting, more soldiers moving toward him. He got out of the crater on the north side, moving away from the sounds coming closer. He ran 20 yards and fell behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle.
Bullets hit the ground near the crater and the downed tree. The soldiers were shooting whenever they saw movement or heard a sound, not just at targets they were sure about. George stayed low. He glassed the area through a scope, saw movement, 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead soldier. Fired. The soldier dropped. The second soldier dove for cover. 2 rounds left. George heard more voices behind him. The Japanese were flanking, one group approaching from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision. He couldn't win a firefight using a bolt-action rifle when facing several soldiers who had semi-automatic weapons. He had to end the connection, go back toward the American forces. George grabbed his rifle and ran north. He sprinted through the jungle undergrowth. Vines caught his boots. Branches whipped his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him. Bullets flew by, hit trees, and raised dust. George ran for 90 seconds and then jumped into another shell crater. This one was dry. He leaned against the crater wall and listened. The Japanese voices were distant now. They had not pursued. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud is on the stock, and water is still dripping from the barrel. He had 2 rounds left and no stripper clips. The clips were in his pack. The pack was somewhere close to the water-filled crater. At 10:47, George started moving again. Not running, but walking, staying low and using the terrain to hide. He moved northeast toward the American lines. The jungle was quiet. No voices, no movement, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. At 11:13, George reached the American perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him. George identified himself. The sentry led him through. George went to the battalion headquarters and told Captain Morris he was there. Morris wanted a full debrief. George provided it. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 11 hits. Then a firefight with infantry. 3 more kills. 5 total rounds in that engagement. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional, but needed cleaning. Mud in the action. Water in the barrel. Morris told George to clean his rifle and take a rest. No operations tomorrow. The battalion was moving east. The main focus was no longer on the Cruz Groves. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Intelligence suggested they would complete the withdrawal within 2 weeks. George returned to his tent. He took apart the Winchester and spent 2 hours cleaning each part, cosmoline and gun oil. At 2 p.m., orders came from the division's headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see George. George walked toward headquarters, thinking about whether Morris had submitted a bad report. Unauthorized engagement, excessive ammunition expenditure, operating alone without support. Instead, he found Morris and 2 other officers. One of them was Colonel Ferry, the leader of the regiment. Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would take time and need rifles with scopes and men who already knew how to shoot. Ferry mentioned that the division had 14 Springfield rifles with Undertale scopes, along with sniper rifles that were left behind by the Marines. He also said that 40 men in the regiment had already qualified as expert marksmen before they were deployed. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics, and clear any remaining Japanese snipers from American operational areas. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request. George kept his Winchester Model 70. The 14 Springfield rifles, fitted with Undertale scopes, were given to the men George would train. Training began on January 27th. George gathered 40 men at a temporary shooting range located 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were expert marksmen on paper. They had qualified with iron sights at ranges up to 500 yards. but none of them had combat experience as snipers. No one among them had killed a man by surprise. George began with the basics, controlling his breathing, squeezing the trigger properly, and reading the wind. The Springfield rifles weighed 11 pounds when they had the Unatel scopes on them, heavier than the Grand, heavier than George's Winchester. The weight kept the rifles steady, but made them hard to hold for long times. George showed them how to use any available support, like rocks, logs, and sandbags. The jungle rarely offered perfect shooting positions. Snipers had to adjust to the land they were on and made strong shooting positions using whatever materials they could find. Range training lasted 3 days. George had the men shoot at targets. First, shoot at stationary targets that are 100 to 400 yards away. Then practice on moving targets. Finally, target objects that are partly hidden by plants or bushes. By January 30th, 32 out of the 40 men were able to consistently hit targets the size of a person at a distance of 300 yards in real field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Grand. His role was to find targets and keep things safe while the shooter was doing the shooting. After each kill, the roles could switch. This kept both men skilled and stopped the problem that happened when only one shooter was used. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field.
Their goal was to remove Japanese forces located to the west of the Matanakaw River. Intelligence indicated small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in that area. Not snipers, just infantry. Stragglers who had not yet evacuated. The 4 teams got into place at dawn. George was paired with a spotter named Corporal Hayes. They set up on high ground, overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier came onto the path. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier dropped. George pulled the bolt and looked for more targets. None appeared. Over the next 6 hours, George's team engaged 7 more Japanese soldiers on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss due to wind. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day. 0 American casualties. The sniper team kept working into early February. By February 9th, the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers. The number was low because it only included kills where the body could be seen. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers came at night to take soldiers from Cape Esperance, which is on the western end of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. George's team of snipers was responsible for killing the Japanese soldiers who were guarding the paths the enemy was using to leave the area. On February 7th, George was moving close to the Tanaboa River when a Japanese soldier shot him. The bullet hit George on his left shoulder. The impact spun him around and knocked him down. Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major blood vessels. George was taken to a field hospital that was close to Henderson Field. The doctors washed the injury and stitched it up. They told George he would recover but needed rest. No combat activities will take place for at least 3 weeks. George stayed at the field hospital for 2 weeks. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American troops arrived at Cape Esperance and discovered that it was deserted. The campaign was over. George's sniper team had been working for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was officially acknowledged by the division's headquarters. Colonel Ferry recommended George for a Bronze Star. But George's war was not finished. While he was recovering at the field hospital, orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army was looking for experienced officers who could fight in a new mission, which was in Burma and involved secret information. George volunteered. By March, George was on a transport ship heading west across the Pacific.
His Winchester Model 70 was stored in a waterproof case within the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was covered with oilcloth. George did not know the details of the Burma mission. He only knew it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines. A mission where a man with a rifle that can hit targets 600 yards away might be really helpful. The transport reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were told about their task. They would join a new unit, 3,000 men total. The unit had no official designation yet. The men called themselves something else. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The 5307 Composite Unit was officially named on May 28, 1943, but the soldiers had already been training since April. Long-range attacks, staying alive in the jungle, and doing missions without needing regular supplies. The unit was based on the British Brigadier Ordnates Chindits, which were small, mobile groups able to move deep into enemy territory and stay there for a long time. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. His role was not officially listed as sniper. The Army did not have formal sniper positions in its table of organization. George was named as the leader of the rifle platoon, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation stayed with him from Guadalcanal. The battalion leaders knew exactly what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain was different from Guadalcanal, but the principles remained the same. Heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. The Burma jungle would be worse. Steeper land, more rain, and an enemy who knew the area better than any American troops. George adjusted his equipment for the Burma mission. The Winchester Model 70 worked well during the fighting on Guadalcanal, but those missions were short-range and allowed for regular restocking. Burma would involve patrols lasting weeks, hundreds of miles through jungle. Every ounce of weight mattered. George took off the Lyman Alaskan scope and put a lighter Weaver 330 in its place. The Weaver had the same 2.5 power magnification, but it weighed 8 ounces less. He also replaced the wooden stock with a lighter synthetic version. The changes made the rifle lighter, bringing its weight down from 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14 ounces. Not much, but over 2 patrols, carrying 60 pounds of equipment, every ounce mattered. The Marauders went into Burma in February 1944. Their goal was to move forward through northern Burma and take control of the Mitkanaya airfield. The airfield was vital for Allied supply lines to China. Japanese forces had around 4,000 soldiers in control of the area. The Marauders would come by land through areas the Japanese thought were too hard for big groups of troops to pass through. Mountains, rivers, dense jungle. No roads, limited trails. The force would transport all supplies either by carrying them on their own backs or using pack mules. No vehicles, no heavy artillery, just rifles, mortars, and the ability to move swiftly through the most challenging terrain. George's group started their journey on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria cases increased daily. The pack mules struggled with the terrain. Some of them had to be shot because they broke their legs on steep downhill sections. By March, the battalion had traveled 217 miles. They had engaged Japanese forces 12 times. Small skirmishes, ambushes, quick firefights followed by rapid withdrawal. The Marauders were not meant to hold ground. They were supposed to move around, cause trouble, disrupt the Japanese supply lines, and make things unstable behind their lines. George used his Winchester rifle 3 times while marching. Once at 412 yards, facing a Japanese officer who was directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards, facing a machine gun nest. Once at 290 yards against a sniper who had pinned down a Marauder patrol. 3 shots, 3 kills. George never shot more than 1 time during each encounter. The Winchester report different sound, not like the Garand's sharp crack. 1 shot announced his presence. A second shot would give the Japanese time to find him. George learned to shoot and move immediately. The march to Mitkanaya took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 meters. They lost more men to disease than combat: malaria, dysentery, and typhus. The unit that entered Burma with 5,300 men was reduced to fewer than 3,000 defectives. On May 17th, the Marauders took control of Mitkanaya airfield. The operation worked, but the price was very high. The unit was combat ineffective. Too many people were hurt, too many got sick, and there was too much time spent in the jungle without any break or good medical help. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester stayed in his possession, but the rifle that had worked so well on Guadalcanal was only used 7 times during 3 months of operations. The Marauders didn't often use scoped rifles for long-distance, precise shooting. Most combat involved close-range ambushes at 50 yards or less, as well as firefights in dense vegetation where visibility was limited to just 30 feet. George understood something important during his 3 months in Burma. The Winchester Model 70 was a great rifle, maybe the best bolt-action sporting rifle that was ever made. But modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming the standard choice. The next conflict would demand new tools and strategies. But there would be no next war for George. Not immediately. By June 1944, he was taken out of Burma along with the other members of the Marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was moved to handle training tasks in the United States. He never used his Winchester Model 70 in battle again. George came back to the United States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His job was teaching infantry officers how to shoot accurately and how to fight effectively in small groups. He taught the lessons he had learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma: how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at a distance, and how to operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle went from Illinois to Tennessee, then to Guadalcanal, India, Burma, and finally to Georgia. It killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in fights that were confirmed, and likely more than that. George had stopped counting after Burma. The rifle was placed in a footlocker inside his room at Fort Benning. He rarely looked at it.
The war had changed. The Pacific Islands were being retaken, one by one. American soldiers were moving forward through France and into Germany. The need for people who can shoot with their own rifles was disappearing. The military was standardizing mass production, using interchangeable parts, soldiers with the same equipment and the same training. George understood the necessity. Modern warfare required industrial scale, but something was being lost: the individual skill, the craftsman approach to soldiering, the concept that a well-trained individual with the appropriate weapon could alter the result of a conflict. George left the Army in January 1947, Lieutenant Colonel with 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University under the GI Bill. He studied politics and graduated with the highest honors in 1950. After finishing his time at Princeton, George went to Oxford for 4 years and then spent another 4 years in British East Africa, where he studied regional politics and institutions. He eventually settled in Washington, D.C. as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he worked as a consultant and teacher at the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute, focusing on African affairs. George didn't talk about Guadalcanal or Burma in public during that time. He had coworkers who knew he had been in the Pacific, but they didn't know about Point Cruz. They weren't aware of the Japanese snipers. They were unaware of the Winchester Model 70 that was kept in a case at his home. In 1947, George chose to write down everything that had happened, not for publishing, just for his personal notes. He wanted to record the weapons and methods used in fighting in the jungle while the information was still clear and recent. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to over 400 pages. A friend from the National Rifle Association read the manuscript and recommended it for publication. George was reluctant.
The book was technical, providing detailed descriptions of rifles, ammunition, and ballistics, not the type of content that regular readers would be interested in. But the NRA convinced him. The book was published in 1947 with the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a favorite among people who love guns and those who study military history. The book details George's experiences on Guadalcanal and Burma with clinical precision. No fancy words, no praising anyone, just the truth about what worked and what didn't in battle. The book is still being made today and is still used by collectors and historians who study World War II weapons. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons are among the most detailed and up-to-date accounts that are still available today. George lived to see the United States fight 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. He saw how military rifles changed over time, starting with the Garand, then moving to the M14, and finally to the M16. He saw sniping turn into an official military job that requires special training and tools. He observed the lessons of World War II being relearned and refined by new generations of soldiers. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 rifle, which was used to kill Japanese snipers during the battle on Guadalcanal, was given to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It is placed in a display case along with a sign that explains its background. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It seems like a regular old vintage hunting rifle, but it isn't. A regular rifle helped a state champion marksman who bought a scope online beat trained military snipers in shooting accuracy. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz Groves in 4 days when an entire battalion could not do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that transformed the American military's approach to individual marksmanship in modern warfare. If this story touched you the same way it touched us, please do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. The system employs a serverless architecture with AWS Lambda, Amazon S3, IAM, CloudWatch, and Docker to automatically compress images as they are uploaded, ensuring efficient storage and fast delivery without any ongoing server maintenance or API gateway. It maintains quality while saving costs and improving performance. Stories about riflemen who show their skill and bravery. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment now and let us know where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just watching, you're helping to keep these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for ensuring John George isn't lost in silence. These people deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.